it's really heartwarming to see the hall filled out with avid and keen supporters and beautiful people for today's brilliant discussion. We have a phenomenal lineup of speakers on the panel, and I just want to say that I am very honored to be the person who introduces them. But before we start, I really want to welcome everyone today. Thank you for coming, and thanks for your support and for activism over the past 2 years and beyond. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and before I start my bit, as Paula would say, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging that this land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to acknowledge and I want to remind everyone that we're meeting today on a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, but its echoes still reverberate to our day. You probably heard the announcement a couple of days ago, the problematic Trump's deal, but we all feel that bit of respite nonetheless, that there is a ceasefire and there is a bit of a break for people in Gaza to have after 2 long years of bombardment, of suffering beyond human imagination. And so, me being from Gaza and hearing the news on Al Jazeera yesterday, I still haven't comprehended how I feel fully about it. But like I said to everyone, I feel cautiously relieved that there is a semblance of quiet and people can sleep and possibly eat and, if available, have a shower and not be listening to all the drones and the bombardment and running around and being targeted all the time. I've been in Gaza a few weeks before the genocide had started, and when I spoke to my sister yesterday, she said, "I'm really glad that you came and saw Gaza before it happened." Back then, I hadn't seen Gaza for 10 years, and it was completely transformed. Gaza was really beautiful. You probably see on TV, it doesn't look anything like what we live in here. We take everything for granted, but despite the shortages, despite the atrocities, the blockade, the siege, Gaza was really genuinely beautiful, organically, naturally, beaches, the people, the spirit. And I joined my sister in saying I'm glad I was there and I saw it before what happened. And physically the damage and the destruction can be repaired, might be challenging, but the emotional, the mental, the psychological damage might take longer. And I'm hopeful that this ceasefire will stick, although the deal is very problematic and challenging to maintain, but let's have that blind hope nonetheless. Before I start introducing our discussion today and panelists, I really want to introduce someone special who also came from Gaza. She is going to speak to us for a few minutes about her story, being in Gaza and being able to finally leave, and to reflect on what she feels about leaving Gaza. I think that would be the highlight. Before she starts speaking, I don't know what she's going to talk about, but I think that would be the highlight, because everyone talks about their journey, their mental reflection about Gaza after what happened, after the genocide. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Hanin Samak. Please join me in.
Thank you so much. Actually, before I will start, I want to begin acknowledge to the First Nation people of this land who have generously welcomed me and my family who have come from Gaza, and honor the elders, the community who have survived. I feel honored to be here. It's hard for me and for my family to leave our home and to leave everything which I love. Tonight, I would like to acknowledge the survivors, especially those who are still in Gaza and their families, our children, our people. I wish to honor the martyrs we have lost and all souls who are no longer with us, whose names and memories will never ever be forgotten. And for the fathers who left us legacy of dignity and resilience. We come from Gaza, and we are both honored to learn from strength, resilience of their people, the First Nation communities here. My life not look like any normal life. I grew up in the large family number with 10 siblings. My mother was a school principal, and my father worked at university. They taught me and taught my family that the land is treasure. Return is right, and that what truly matters to human connection. Dignity and resilience, not war. Through war after, I chose not to give in disappear. I have decided myself to education and community work, standing behind women and behind persons with disabilities and families who have lost everything. My husband and I built my life and home in our hands, raising four children. Even the bomb fell around us. As even the daughter was born in a war. Again and again, Gaza has called on us to be strong, to learn, to rebuild, and to reach out to one another. Now, in 2024, your support means more than ever. Standing together and offering our solidarity can make all difference. Gaza struggle and belong to be all humanity. I will read some from Mus'ab Abu Taha. I would like to end these words. Every child in Gaza is me. Every mother and father is me. Every house is my heart. Every tree is my leg. Every plant is my arm. Every flower is my eye. Every hole is my ear, is my word. I will ask all of you to stand 1 minute, please, for the martyrs in Gaza, to accept and honor them. Thank you all. Ahmed asked me to talking about journey, to talking about myself when I left Gaza. It's hard. It's hard. It's very hard moment to decide to leave Gaza because it's not easy. Not because I lost my house, my land, my neighbors, my friends, my 12 from my families, and still every single day I lost at least one or two from the community I work with, and it's hard to lose all the people, but I believe one thing. I believe to looking forward for the future because we love not we love Gaza, we love Palestine. So we believe we will be return back to Palestine. Thank you for your support. Thank you.
We will be back. We have to be back. There is nowhere else to go. Thank you, Hanin, again. And now, without further ado, I know you're sick of seeing me everywhere. I just want to introduce our fabulous, brilliant, and all these great adjectives I can add. I'm not really well seasoned in the language, but please welcome. First, I want to welcome. I forgot the order, but I'll go ahead with Randa Abdel-Fattah. Paula, Abood, please join us on the phone. And last but not the least, Dr. Lana Tatour.
Thank you so much, Ahmed and Hanin. And Ahmed, thank you for grounding us, not only on country, remembering the genocide, the ongoing dispossession here, but reminding us that every moment, every event, Gaza is our centre and our heart, so thank you. We, of course, want to start with Gaza, but I'm just going to hand to Lana, maybe just to say a few words, given we had such a heartfelt and beautiful beginning.
Thank you, Paula. Well, Paula stole my words. I was about to start with Gaza is the heart of Palestine. And I'm so grateful to Ahmed and Hanin for being here. And maybe I'll come to Gaza in a second. I just want to say how heartwarming it is to see colleagues, friends, and community. And thank you so much for being here. And to say that probably this launch would not have happened without a number of people, Paula, Randa, Jumana Baye, who's sitting in the first row, Nama, Carlin, Ahmed, and I'm really grateful to be part of this community, and they really shown what feminist care is. I just needed to turn up, so huge thank you to everyone. I also want to start by saying that the book, this book is edited, co-edited with Ronit Lentin. And I'm so very grateful and so proud of what we've achieved and privileged to have worked with beautiful, brilliant group of contributors. So it has been really incredible journey working on the book. We're here on stolen land. We're here sitting on the rubbles of genocide, but also as a reminder that genocide doesn't end. And as we talk about Gaza today, ceasefire. It may be a ceasefire, but the genocide continues. and it continues in so many different ways. It continues with all the indirect deaths that are going still to be resulting in Gaza. It continues with the loss of entire families, thousands of families who have been wiped out. They have wiped out the heritage in Gaza, libraries. They're trying to wipe out Palestinian history, Palestinian presence. And we're not talking about it here in just symbolic way, but we're seeing it in Gaza in the most brutal form of erasure. And as we sit here, we are remembering that genocide is not an event. Genocide is the structure, borrowing from Patrick Wolf, but also really the last few years reminded us that elimination and genocide are not so far off, and that what we've seen in Gaza is an extreme form of elimination in the form of genocide, but it is structural.
So I guess in the context of a book about race and the question of Palestine, thank you for the introduction in this book. As Ahmed said, it's a book in itself, the introduction. It really is transdisciplinary across histories of race, histories especially foregrounding Arab and Palestinian thinkers and activists, which for me is a really important part of this book. I know you spoke about Gaza in terms of, centrally. I think one of the things that's really of the moment is the world is looking at Gaza through, like for me, having worked in and read and my thinking over the last 3 decades around race, there's never been a question that race isn't integral and inherent and foundational to, for me, not the question of Palestine, but the question of Israel. So I suppose with Gaza, it's the ground zero of speaking about race. Is that how you come to, I guess, thinking, especially of this moment in across time and space?
Oh, absolutely. So maybe I'll talk a bit about how this book was born. It started long before the genocide. It's taken too long. It started, I think, in 2018 or 2019. So this is why I'm so grateful to the contributors. They've been extremely patient. And you're saying, today we look at Gaza and we look at Palestine and we say, of course race is central to Palestine. We can't understand Palestine without also looking at race. But it hasn't always been the case. There is a long legacy of speaking about race in Palestine studies, which we'll get to a bit later on. But when we started, and Ronit and I, it was at the moment that I finished my PhD, and it wasn't on race in Palestine. I was actually reading, literature on 48 Palestinians who are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And I realized that all the literature that I'm reading is actually speaking about Israel in terms of ethnicity, as an ethnic state or as an ethnocracy, where there is ethnic privilege of one group over the other. And on the other hand, I was reading early Palestinian, literature, and race was there all the time. At the same time, so I started thinking about what do we gain and what do we lose? So what do we lose when we don't talk about race? And why are we talking about ethnicity instead of race? And at the same time, Ronit had her book on racializing settler colonialism come out. And we met at this particular point of time when we're both thinking about race and Palestine in different ways. So we decided to move forward with this project, and actually finding contributors was not an easy task at that particular point of time. Today, if we want to assemble that book, it would be very easy task, very easy. So many scholars to approach, wonderful scholars, and to solicit chapters from. But it has spoken, but that spoke in that particular moment of 2018, 2019, to the fact that race was not really as prominent in that particular moment of Palestine studies. And even though settler colonialism has made a return in Palestine studies, and we were thinking about Palestine through this prism, ethnicity still remained the main framework through which we saw Palestine. And I remember when I was giving, talks or in conferences and mentioning race, I'll always get a few people raising their hands and saying, this is not race, this is about national groups, right? This is not about race. So now, with Gaza, no one can say this is not about race. Race is absolutely there. There is no genocide without race, without dehumanization, without thinking about race in relation also to the ways in which, categories of humanity, some are attributed humanity and others are deprived of being considered as human. So today it's very hard to say that no, this is about national groups. This is, race is not relevant. It's absolutely there. It is there in the media, in the ways in which Gaza is covered, in the ways in which probably hundreds of thousands killed, but we're all focusing on the Israeli refugees. Well, not us, obviously. On the Israeli, hostages. We see it in the ways in which sexual violence against Palestinians is completely ignored, in genocide denial. We see it around us in our universities, in our institutions. So race is really around us, and the labor of convincing people, which is why this book was born, that race matters for, that race is a relevant category for the question of Palestine. At least that labor is not something we need to do anymore, but then we need to think, so how do we read race in Palestine? What kind of readings of race do we have? How do we understand Palestine in relation to race?
And also, one of the most simple examples of how race is evidenced in Gaza is the prisoner hostage swap. 48 hostages for, I think, 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. So you can see there's an equation for you to tell you what the category of humanity is valued as, and it is not equal. So my question, I'm going to set it up. First of all, can I ask how many academics are here today? Okay. So we just know that, yeah. Because we're here always to be accessible and not to speak in jargon, so I want to be really mindful of that as well. And my daughter warned me. Make sure. So I wanted to set up this question in the context of two real-life examples. The first, how many of you saw the viral video about the hairdresser in Melbourne who turned away a customer? And I'm just going to read out the exchange. I want to know why you kicked someone out when you found out they were Israeli. Do you always ask people with ethnic accents where they come from? Do you know that's against the law? The Racial Discrimination Act is based on nationality. To which the hairdresser responded, Israelis aren't a race. The second example is two amazing academics, Dr. Nick Raymer, who's here today, and Professor John Keane at Sydney University, who are currently embroiled in the Zionist lobby's warfare. And a case has been brought against them under Australia's Racial Discrimination Act, which will be the first to explicitly test whether Zionism should be protected under race hate laws. And I want to set my question up in the context of these kind of understandings and misunderstandings of race. The chapters of this incredible book offer a critique of how race is conceptualized, understood in international law, in academia, in politics, in activist conversations. And we hear these words thrown out over and over again: race, racist, racialization, racism. And they are highly contested. Not everybody agrees on what they mean, even if people pretend that they know what they're talking about. So there's a strong argument in the book that there is a lack of racial literacy across these sites. And in your introduction, Lana, your brilliant introduction, you really survey all these limited understanding, contestations, misreadings of race. And your main point, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is how all of this obscures, distracts from how race is politically mobilized, is used for, political work to engineer and in service of colonial domination. So I want to ask you 3 mini questions. The first is, can you take us through, break down through us, these different understandings of race? Can you also then talk to us about how it's been approached in the Palestinian legacy and the Palestine studies? And lastly, and I think my examples show you, what are the stakes here for getting this wrong?
Well, Randa doesn't start easy. I'll start with the kind of the misconceptions of race. So, when we submitted the book, our wonderful commissioning editor, Kate, said, Lana, why do you start with the negative? Why are you starting with how not to understand race? And I was like, first of all, it's my personality. I start with the negative. This is how I think. Well, this is wrong. And what can we do? But also, it spoke to a very particular moment. And as those of you who will torture themselves with the introduction will see that I insisted to start with the negative, with how not to read race. And the reason is that we had between, I think it was 2021, 2022, we had all these apartheid reports come out by the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, then by Human Rights Watch, then by Amnesty International. We also had the report by the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, and they all determined that Israel is practicing apartheid between the river and the sea. Well, obviously, there is one dimension of racial politics there. We've said that long time ago. We've been saying that for decades, right? And we've produced the work to actually show that Israel is practicing apartheid and racial domination. But then I was more interested in how race is being understood within these reports, because these reports became a way to speak about race in Palestine. Because how can you talk about apartheid without actually talking about race? And I started looking on the different ways, and it relates also to international law, obviously, and how international law looks at the question of race. And for that, I would refer you to the wonderful chapter by John Reynolds on apartheid without race. And what I saw is, first, there was the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, and they said Israel is practicing Jewish supremacy and apartheid. But race is not a relevant category. They literally write this because in Israel, it is about ethnicity and nationalism. It is not about skin color. The first thought I had is, what a flawed conception of race. And I went to look at who are the academic advisors to this nonsense. But with Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Special Rapporteur, the story was quite different. They didn't dismiss race, but what they said is, the way they approached race is, can we establish, going back to the examples that you started with, who is a race? So are Palestinians a race? Are Israelis a race, right? So who is a race? Because you need actually under international law to establish that there are racial groups. That these groups, to establish racial domination, there has to be a definition of racial groups and they need to fit. And the ways they have done it is to say, well, they are treated, Palestinians are treated as a racial group, so as Israelis, by the virtue of their ethnicity and nationalism. Different ethnicity and different nationality. And therefore, we can treat them as racial group. So really it was about who is a race. It was very kind of positivist approach. And they did say that they look at race as social construction. They did say that they're taking subjective approach to race. But in practice, they weren't looking at the political work of race. And they weren't looking at the ideologies that, how can you talk about Jewish supremacy without talking about Zionism? None of these reports have addressed Zionism. None of these reports have addressed settler colonialism. It is as if racial discrimination and racial domination operates on its own. There is no ideology that allows it to happen, that facilitates it, that produces it. And that was what I have addressed in the past, and also John Reynolds in this book as well, and many others who have written about the question of apartheid, that produced a liberal reading of apartheid, or in other words, also a liberal reading of race. And when you ask what is on stake is that we remove politics, that we don't talk about Zionism, that we don't talk about the settler colonialism, we don't talk about what race politics is there to do. And going back to Gaza, it is there to eliminate. It is there to justify the removal of Palestinians. It is there to say, well, they don't deserve self-determination. They don't deserve sovereignty. They don't deserve life. That was the extreme version of it. And three really big questions. So how did Palestinians understood race? I'm not going to say too much. Get the book. But no, seriously. Since the 60s, Palestinians have always spoken about Palestine in relation to settler colonialism, in relation to race, in relation to imperialism, and in relation to capitalism. So there was an understanding, and the Palestinian question was rooted in third world liberation movements. Every time they talk about Palestine, they talked about race and racism. They talked about Zionism and apartheid. It was never apartheid without Zionism. Apartheid wasn't replacing Zionism. They would say against racism, including apartheid and Zionism. If you go and you trace all this literature, which I would refer you to the chapter by Randa Abdel-Fattah, who traces that history in a beautiful way in the UN. So for Palestinians, there is no Palestine. So the way they theorized it is, you can't understanding Palestine is understanding it as a colonial question, and understanding that colonialism does not exist outside of the grammar of race and outside of racism, that the two are entwined. There is no colonialism without race and racism. And therefore, the Palestinian struggle was also understood in terms of anti-colonialism and anti-racism and anti-imperialism. And what the introduction does, and the first two chapters in the book, is tracing that intellectual and political legacy of Palestinian theorization of race, especially because often that literature and legacy that we have and work that we produce is being ignored with people saying, oh, we're going to integrate race, or we're going to integrate settler colonialism, erasing decades of theorization. It doesn't mean we don't have more to do, but we have a legacy to build on. And really big part of the aim of this book is to highlight that legacy, not in a sentence, but actually to trace it through the introduction, through the chapter of Noor Ariqat, through the chapter of John Reynolds. And I think that provides a very solid basis. No one can say we didn't do work on race.
to Nora Erika's amazing chapter. I actually went straight to that chapter after the introduction because it's about the UN resolution. And, 30 years ago in Sydney, at the cusp of rescinding that resolution,
You mentioned what the resolution is.
Yeah, I'm going to mention that resolution. I'm going to get you to mention that resolution. That's your question. The erasure of the activism, in the Palestinian and the broader Arabic-speaking community is really important. So I want to go to that point of Zionism as a form of racism to foreground that. As an ideology, Zionism's fundamental premise is exterminatory logic. To mask the racist nature of Zionism's foundational purpose, slogans like "a land without people for a people without land" is a calculated strategy that functions in precisely the same way that terra nullius worked for the racism of British colonialists as they perpetrated a campaign of genocidal violence against First Nations peoples here. So, in exactly 4 weeks from today, the 10th of November, 50 years ago, so on November the 10th, 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 3379 that officially confirmed that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Of course, our conversation, today's resolution would be Zionism is racism. That's what we talk about. But I guess mapping out that history in Nora's chapter has been really important. The official history, the UN history, but also the backstory of Palestinians from the 60s. What I love about that chapter is honouring Fayez Sayed's amazing 1965, you have to read it, I've downloaded it, inquiry into racism, settler colonialism, like 1965. So just to your point, that there's a legacy, and let's honour that legacy of Palestinian thinkers. So in that 1975 General Assembly resolution, the majority of the international community backed it. 72 countries voted for the resolution, 35 opposed, and the usual 32 spineless abstentions. The nations that voted against the resolution were primarily colonial powers and their axis of evil, the usual suspects. The countries, or the nations that voted for the resolution, were overwhelmingly formally colonised and anti-imperialist nations that make up the global south. When the resolution was passed, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Herzog, the father of the current Herzog, president, famously tore up the text at the podium. So in this chapter, for me, reading the history affirmed how important, even though Gaza has demonstrated to us that every institutional and governance structure has failed us, has failed Palestinians, including the International Court, Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. Symbolically, how important, I guess, the valency, not just of the history, but recognising and being able to say in material ways when people are being taken to the Human Rights Commission for the conflation of anti-Semitism is, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. How important do you think, in the context of speaking about race, is a UN resolution a contemporary resolution, if you like?
Thank you for that question. And Paula and I were talking about it in preparation also for today. And a few months ago, actually, my partner reminded me that it's going to be 50 years to the resolution. And I forgot about that, right? And then Paula said it's going to be this year, 50 years. And I think it's very significant that this is 50 years. And again, speaking of the genocide in Gaza, maybe if that resolution was taken seriously, then we wouldn't be in the context of the Gaza genocide. Noura's chapter is really significant in tracing this history, but it doesn't just trace that history. It does really important labor in looking how race was theorized at the level of the UN in relation to that resolution. And how through that also Palestinians developed particular theories of race. That resolution was, that resolution is probably one of the most significant, if not the most significant achievements that Palestinians have made in the UN. The acknowledgement that Zionism is racism. And again, we were able to do that, or they were able to do that because of that particular moment where, the third world spirit was still existing, and that kind of anti-imperial, anti-racist solidarity and anti-colonial solidarity that allowed this resolution to pass. Although Noura also kind of traces the contentions around that when different states were threatened in the process. It was just, you mentioned that it was rescinded in 1990, and the PLO gave up our most important achievement in the UN for what? For entering the peace talks for the Oslo Accords. Not for the Oslo Accords, which would have been bad as well, don't get me wrong. Simply for entering negotiations with Israel. That was a condition. The PLO was in a very awkward, problematic international position during this period. This first intifada has also started. New Palestinian leadership was emerging in the West Bank and in Gaza. It wanted to reestablish its authority and its importance as the central leader of the Palestinian struggle while they were in Tunis after they were expelled from Lebanon. And they were willing to throw our most significant achievement at the UN. Where we are today is, yes, we need another resolution of Zionism as racism, but we are also in a situation where any suggestions of Zionism as a racist ideology we are facing attempts to criminalize it, right? Through the IHRA definition and through other forms and other institutions. And that kind of, if you do scholarly work on it, if you wanna teach Noura's chapter, everything could be sanctioned, right? You could face repercussions for any form of suggestion. And there is a reason for that, because Israel has worked and its lobby for a very long time to make the question of Zionism, race, and racism a taboo. And moving forward, we really can't we can't understand Palestine. We can't, do the struggle without insisting on opening the question of Zionism. There is no way forward without opening the question of Zionism. They try to shut it down, we keep trying to keep openings for, having a conversation about it, of having that racial ideology acknowledged for what it is as racist. So to your question, it's really significant. I want to see the country that would bring that resolution again in the UN. I was thinking maybe of Mexico?
Colombia.
Colombia, sorry, Colombia. I was thinking of Colombia, sorry. We were talking about it, sorry. It would be wonderful, right? But I would also love to see the human rights community opening that conversation and touching that topic, because the human rights community, international human rights organizations, even special rapporteurs on Palestine, they don't touch Zionism. So there is a long way to go, but we've been saying it since 50s and 60s, and will continue. And at some point they will catch up with us, as they caught up with apartheid, and then they caught up with genocide, and they will catch up with Zionism is racism again.
You were saying before, Lana, like focusing on the ideology. So the question of race and the political work race does is crucial. It's also the political work that denying race does. And the fact is that to talk about Zionism, it really strikes at the existential project of Israel, that extermination and genocide are an existential necessity for the state of Israel to exist. It cannot be, they have shown us it cannot be any other way. And this is the questions that they want to avoid, and this is what the human rights organizations and reports want to avoid. By ignoring the question of race and Zionism, in a way they are still trying to save Israel in some form, and that's the liberal project there, that they can somehow reform a fundamentally racist, exterminatory, logical project. So that's one of the issues. So following on from this question of race and racism, the process of racialization in the various racial groups that the state of Israel, the project of Israel and Zionist project has produced is really key to this. And the book masterfully treats this subject across a few chapters. And I wanted you to talk us through these regimes of racialization that have been produced, the different categories. For example, the legal system which transforms Jews of different categories and backgrounds into one homogenous category. British colonial discourses and policies which, distinguish the Bedouin as a racial category, and the political work that classification did. And the Mizrahim and the racialization of Jews of Middle East and North African origins. And finally, the racial exclusion of Palestinian refugees. There's a few chapters on this, so I'm asking you really to synthesize what all of that means.
Thank you. So it was important for us to think about race also in terms of how specific groups are racialized, because not everyone is racialized in the same way. Also, Palestinians are not racialized in the same way. Palestinians are fragmented across different territories, and they have different statuses. There are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. There are Palestinians in East Jerusalem who have Israeli residency, which is supposed to be permanent, but nothing is permanent about it because it could be revoked by the discretion of the Minister of Interior. So it is less than citizenship. But on the other hand, it is higher than the status of Palestinians in the West Bank who are under occupation. And then there is Gaza, it's under occupation and under siege and now genocide. So, and then we have Palestinian diaspora, and Palestinian diaspora also experience racializations in very particular ways, depending also on where they are. And within these groups also, we have the Bedouin. The Bedouin are racialized differently than other Palestinians. So one thing that we want to capture is that, there are regimes of race, and that different groups are racialized differently, and that matters for us to understand what kind of political work race is engineered to advance in terms of colonization. But also to trace the kind of imperial legacies that inform these racialization. And maybe I'll give an example. So there is a wonderful chapter by Siraj Asi on the Bedouin. And what Siraj does, and his work is absolutely brilliant, is he goes back to British ethnographers, right? In the early 20th century. And he traces how they constructed the Bedouin in their studies as a distinct race. They were the original Arabs, but they were fetishized for their racial purity. They were the noble savages, but they were also the backward and uncivilized nomads. But they did embody this, authenticity of Arabness that in their view other Arabs didn't. And then this racial taxonomy was taken. And in the, actually, I should have said in the late 19th century, because with the Balfour Declaration, this racial taxonomy was put into place, right? Because if the real Arabs are Bedouin, if they're nomads, then Palestine doesn't belong to the Arabs, right? So we see how these constructions of race of different groups also related to how the question of self-determination, statehood, sovereignty in Palestine would be evaluated, will be determined by imperial powers. Similarly, with refugees, with Palestinian refugees, there was this, and it's a chapter by Abigail Bakan and Yasmin Abu Laban, where, Palestinian refugees occupy this inferior place, both in international refugee regime, via the establishment of UNRWA and other mechanisms, but also within who are the refugees that matter. So Israel is a refuge state on the one hand, but that is premised on the denial of Palestinian refugees and their right of return. I do want to talk on the Mizrahi question, because one of the areas in which race really figured prominently in discussions of race in Israel was actually through the Mizrahim, not through the Palestinians. And I'm not talking about Palestinian writing. And the idea was that, in Zionism, there are racial hierarchies. The Ashkenazi white European Jews are at top. And then there is the Mizrahi, where the Oriental Jews originated from, Arab countries. And then you have the Ethiopian Jews. In the middle, you have also the Russian, who are not Jews, but are Jews, right? And it's a different story. But my point is that when it came to the Mizrahim, to the Oriental Jews, there was an acknowledgement that they're racialized and that race matters, but not through Palestinians. So in Mizrahi critical writing, like Ela Shochat and others, they were the victims. They were kind of, if Edward Said wrote Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, Ela Shochat wrote Zionism from the standpoint of its Jewish victims or internal Jews or something along these lines, paraphrasing that. And until today, I'm very troubled with viewing Oriental Jews merely as these victims of Zionism, because they are integral part of the colonization of Palestine. They occupy, Palestinian land, they settle on Palestinian land, they kill Palestinians when they enlist to the army, they enjoy all, the privileges of being on the rubbles of Palestinian existence, but because they're racialized within the intra-Jewish kind of hierarchization, then, we don't talk about their complicity or their participation in that project. But actually, they are an integral part of the racialization of Palestinians and of Palestine. So we do have that chapter. And it's really interesting chapter that actually looks at labor and the ways in which racialization of labor has taken place by the Zionist movement in the early 20th century. And it raises a very interesting story on that.
I want to ask you about gender and race, the intersections of gender and race. And you mentioned the rape of men, and I guess for me, the last 2 years of thinking about, and all of us bearing witness to the atrocities being perpetrated against the people of Gaza, gender and race has been really key in my thinking at the very beginning. The rape atrocity propaganda, for one, where the racist trope of Arab men as bestial, and I want to acknowledge the scholarship of the thinking around gender and race that's come from First Nations, Black feminist thinkers and writers, African American, Black scholars, and Global South feminist thinkers in this space. Really important to acknowledge, because Angela Davis famously wrote about the demonization through racist tropes and lenses of African American men, which legitimated lynchings. And for me, the rape atrocity propaganda that still gets invoked now in terms of legitimating a genocide speaks to how gender cannot be separated from race, and race cannot be separated from gender. So I guess I'm interested in how this book has addressed the interplay of gender and race and that double bind.
Thank you. So there is a chapter written by the co-editor, Ronit, Lentin, on gender and race. And it focuses on rape as well, and how it has been, the kind of representations of rape, and the way in which the racialization of Palestine is also done through these kind of gendered discourses. I think that, we saw it in Palestine as well, how the allegations of mass rape as a weapon of war by, accusation of Hamas of using rape as a weapon of war have been weaponized in order to justify the genocide in Gaza. Now, let's be clear, until now there is no evidence whatsoever, and that's confirmed also by the Independent Commission, that race was used by Hamas systematically as a weapon of war. There is evidence of gender and sexual-based violence that took place in October 7th, but there is no evidence of that. And let's say, even if there was evidence, this is not a pretext for genocide. Let's be clear on that. But I think, where the racial politics come is that we do have ample evidence that show that Israel is using gender and sexual-based violence, as shown by the Independent Commission and many other NGOs, as part of its operations. It's integrated to the ways in which they are punishing and governing Palestinians. It's part of their operation. This is recognized. And this is to humiliate the Palestinian people. There is, a lot significant literature, and Randa, maybe you can add to that, wrote also a wonderful essay about now a year and a half ago, probably, on these accusations, placing them within the broader racial politics of such accusations, also African American, Black Americans, and so on and so forth. But again, the ways in which the media has been, and also Western states have been addressing the sexual violence against Palestinians, which not addressing, ignoring it completely, speaks to that racism that Palestinians are experiencing. And maybe Randa can talk about also the price of writing as Palestinian on these issues, because it does come with a heavy price.
Well, I guess I read that article, and I was in consultation with you all about that. What prompted me to write it was what I had observed, which we all observed, which was how quickly white mainstream feminists, so-called progressives, were to believe this story of a systematic campaign of rape. And the racial logics behind their readiness and their preparedness to buy into these tropes and stereotypes, of the bestial, Arab, brown, and again the fantasy of the black, hypersexualized male. No critical thinking involved, no critical thinking about the timing of these allegations, no critical thinking about the political work done to perpetuate these kinds of mass propaganda campaigns, no critical thinking about the very obvious flaws in the article in the New York Times, the writers of the article. I mean, there's so much evidence that was, that tore apart every single allegation that has been made, and yet people still, until this day, in mainstream media, talk about this as if it is a fact, as if it is a given. And what that enabled is that it has been a critical part of the manufacturing of consent for this genocide. I would say it was just as important as referencing the deaths on October 7 was the mass, the claims of mass rape as a systematic campaign. That probably mobilized people's consent for this more than anything else, because it bought into this idea that they deserve what they get because they are so uncivilized, they are so bestial. And again, the racial trope of they are polluting our women. We have to save our women. We have to protect them from these uncivilized beasts. Again, leaning into the project of Islamophobia as well, and all the work that Islamophobia does to prop up the Zionist regime in the way that it attacks and demonizes and dehumanizes Palestinians. So I want to ask a question now about anti-Palestinian racism. So the book really leans into a lot of the early works here. So I want to do a bit of a history on this, like looking at anti-Palestinian racism as a structural form of racism that is deeply rooted in Western historical racial religious supremacy, settler colonial logics, Orientalism, and Zionist mythologies. And we could spend a whole day talking about the various ways that anti-Palestinian racism expresses itself, practice, and manifests itself. But I wanted to focus on one in the wake of the fact that we are a few days out of the 2-year anniversary of 7th of October, plus 77 years. And I wanted to zoom in on one particular response or practice of anti-Palestinian racism that we see constantly used and weaponized against Palestinians, and that is the racial gaslighting, the active denial of the right of Palestinians to name their political realities, to expose power dynamics, and to refuse to reduce their struggle to one that is personal or pathological, but is rooted in their political realities, which means that even when we wanted to talk about 7 October and 6 October and 5 October and 4 October, going all the way back 100 years, not 77, we were not allowed to do that. So I wanted to give a very small anecdote to pull this question into focus. In 1929, there was a revolt in Palestine at the Burak Wailing Wall Revolt. It spread to other cities and towns throughout Palestine, and it was a case of the British going to very specific and extreme lengths to make changes to mandate judicial process, to characterize the political revolt by Palestinians and their protests solely as acts of criminal violence, ignoring and deliberately suppressing any political element to the protests. And this might give you resonances of what's happening today with our right to protest. The British actually changed laws and the court composition to trial those arrested under murder charges in order to deliver executions. And they did this explicitly to guarantee a process void of politics and to characterize the violence as criminal acts. Only British judges were allowed, so the local Palestinian judges were removed. There were the terms of reference of the Commission of Inquiry into the riots were deliberately confined to only look at immediate causes. They were not allowed to consider the wider political context. The defence throughout the entire process was not allowed to submit any material that put the riots in a political context, and any questions were deemed inadmissible. Seeing how anti-Palestinian racism unfolds today, Lana, in the way our political context, our 200, 300, well, how many ever days of genocide plus 77 years is not allowed in our disciplinary actions, in lawfare, in media interviews, in protests, in parliamentary inquiries. I think that this case, all the way back as 1929, isn't just a case of deja vu. It's a reminder of anti-Palestinian racism, racial and colonial roots, and how that is always at the centre of the way that we are erased and dehumanised. Are you able to speak to this?
Yeah, that is a big question. I think the denial of anti-Palestinian racism just speaks to how much racism there is against Palestinians. So that very denial has something to tell us. And I think in the case of Palestinians, and I always say it, it's not that only that the racism against us is being denied, but we are actually competing, and I'm putting competing in quotation marks, with the worst type of racism that is recognized by the West, which is anti-Semitism. And because there has been so much investment by the West to, shed its guilt out of, anti-Semitism, we are now cast as the producers of anti-Semitism. So it's not white supremacy, it's not, Christian racial mythologies, it's not the old school anti-Semitism, it's what they call the new anti-Semitism, which is really a racial move to produce us as those who are producing anti-Semitism. And if we are producing anti-Semitism, it means we are producing the worst type of racism. So there's all these kind of moves, and that means that the racism against us goes unacknowledged. But also, how do we read anti-Palestinian racism? And I was actually just having a conversation the other day with Randa Abdel-Fattah. Some of you might know her, Sydney University. She works at APAN now. And we were talking about anti-Palestinian racism, and she was saying, I'm actually quite concerned in the ways in which we understand, like where it's heading, right? And she was referring to the Australian Human Rights Commission. So how are we going to read anti-Palestinian racism? Is it going to be that kind of liberal, problematic reading of the Australian Human Rights Commission? And she says, I'm really, concerned about that, when actually we need to read it in relation to settler colonialism. And then I added, it's actually thinking about it this way. It's thinking about anti-Palestinian racism as a form also of anti-Indigenous racism. Especially when we're thinking about it from this location in the colony. So what are the relationship between these kind of two types of racism, but it's also a form of that particular type of racism. So I guess, again, we started, and maybe we can end there, but we started the conversation with kind of the liberal readings of race. And then we have, we want to move away also from liberal readings of anti-racism. And I think anti-Palestinian racism is being, yes, increasingly acknowledged. I mean, we hear more and more about it. It is not as denied as it used to be, still is, but not as denied. But we're now facing the struggle of how do we understand it? I'm sorry, I'll speak in the name of three of us when I say we want to see it as anti-colonial, within that framework, and not within the framework of liberal institutions and the kind of interpretation that they bring to it. So I guess that's also part of the struggle as we think about the Palestinian struggle as anti-colonial and anti-racist, is that we really move away from cooptation of that struggle in liberal terms.
Thank you, Lana. That's all we had planned to speak about this evening. I want to thank both editors for gifting us, and the contributors, the amazing contributors, for gifting us this knowledge, this journey into deep reflection that for me builds our praxis. And I want to just read, I love Nora's ending. It's really important. I mean, this book, as I said at the beginning, foregrounds Palestinian thinkers and draws on lived experience, and especially for First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples, it's the beginning for us all who work in solidarity, so that we move towards liberation, towards restorative justice, towards self-determination. So we want to end with the words of our beautiful sister Nora, who asks, what happens when we do not impose a theory on Palestine, but allow Palestinian experience to provide a theory for us? What would be gained and what would be lost in that practice? The only thing we can tell for certain is that understanding the racial dimension of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, including that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, is work that is still ongoing on the ground and in scholarship. It remains our unfinished business. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you. Can I thank Addie as well?
Where's Ahmed?
Here.
Here's Ahmed.
It's your... Where's
Where's
Ahmed?
Ahmed?
It's a jigsaw puzzle. Where's
Ahmed
Ahmed?
too.
Here.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, brilliant Randa and Lana. I can't top that up, really. I mean,
Come, Paula.
I actually kind of warned you. I kind of warned you how rich and brilliant the conversation will be, and the book is. This is kind of the conversation that really excites me, and it really satisfies my kind of intellectual, if I have one, ability. But it's really important book. Unfortunately, we ran out of all copies, but we do have a voucher at the table on your way out. You will get 20% discount if you grab one of those vouchers. And if you grab one of those flyers as well, we have a webinar happening soon, and we have other events. Please grab a flyer.
Trivia night.
And the trivia night happening, and of course the national rally on Sunday.
And Mahmoud.
Did I miss anything? There's Mahmoud.
Mahmoud from Gaza.
Mahmoud from Gaza. Yeah.
Grab one on your way out.
And yes, there's one more special thing. Don't stand up, just 1 second.
Thank you, Lana. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Hanin, for your beautiful sharing too.